March 24th, 1945. 31,000 feet above Berlin. Hauptmann Dieter Kessler adjusted his oxygen mask and smiled beneath the leather as he watched the distant formation through the reinforced canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G14. The veteran of Jagdgeschwader 53 had flown 247 combat missions across 3 years, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen skies of the Eastern Front. He'd faced British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, and swarms of American Mustangs and Thunderbolts. But today, something different caught his attention. The bomber escort approaching from the south flew in tight, disciplined formation, but their aircraft wore a distinctive feature that made Kessler's lips curl into a contemptuous grin. Bright red tails. "Achtung, Schwarm," he'd transmitted to his flight of 4. "The Amerikaner have sent us their circus performers, the Neger squadron." The racial slur crackled through the radio, followed by laughter from his wingmen. Every Luftwaffe pilot in the Reich knew about them, the Negro fighter group the Americans had foolishly deployed to combat. Kessler had heard the stories from other Luftwaffe pilots, undertrained, overcautious, more concerned with protecting bombers than engaging in real combat. Schwarze who had no business in the cockpit of a fighter plane. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Kessler didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like predators above the Reich capital could have understood, was that he was staring at the most lethal escort fighter group in the entire 15th Air Force. The 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, had compiled a combat record that would eventually shame every assumption, every prejudice, every dismissive laugh. The mathematics of their achievement were already written in the mission logs stacked in operations rooms across Italy. 15,000 sorties flown, 112 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, another 150 obliterated on the ground, 950 railcars, trucks, and vehicles annihilated, and most remarkably, a defensive record that would become the stuff of legend. But on this cold March morning, all Kessler saw were easy targets painted in carnival colors like practice drones marked for slaughter. 60 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 5th Bombardment Wing droned steadily toward their target, the Daimler-Benz Tank Works in Berlin's industrial heart. Above and around them, 51 North American P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group maintained their protective formation, red tails gleaming in the harsh sunlight streaming through the thin atmosphere. Captain William Wild Bill Campbell, leading the 99th Fighter Squadron from his Mustang, Lucifer's Chariot, scanned the sky through his fighter's bubble canopy. The former sharecropper's son from Tuskegee, Alabama, had 428 combat hours in his logbook and 5 confirmed kills. He learned to fly on the segregated airfield in Alabama, where the Army Air Forces had reluctantly trained black pilots, certain they would fail. They hadn't failed. They had excelled. Campbell's wingman, First Lieutenant Harold Hap Brown, flew type formation off his right wing. Brown was a mathematics teacher from Chicago before the war, and his Mustang, christened Brown Bomber, had already accounted for 3 German fighters. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," Brown's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. "Count 16, mixed 109s and 190s. Campbell had already seen them, Kessler's formation descending from their patrol altitude, positioning for the classic bounce from above and behind, standard Luftwaffe tactics executed thousands of times against American bomber formations. "Roger that, Hap. Red flight, maintain escort position. Blue flight, with me. Let's show these gentlemen some hospitality." 16 P-51s broke formation, climbing to meet the German fighters, while the remaining 35 stayed glued to the bombers. This was the Tuskegee doctrine that had earned them the grudging respect of bomber crews. Never abandon the heavies. Never chase glory at the expense of the mission. It was a doctrine that had cost them kills compared to the glory-hunting ace factories of other fighter groups, but it had saved hundreds of American lives.
Kessler pushed his throttle forward, the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine responding with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The 109's nose dropped into a shallow dive, building speed for the attack run. His three wingmen maintained perfect formation. They'd flown together since the Kursk offensive, survivors of the Eastern Front's meat grinder. "Standard approach," Kessler transmitted. "Dive through the Schwarms, engage the bombers. They won't follow. They never do." It was true, according to every intelligence report Kessler had read. The Negro squadron was pathologically defensive, refusing to break formation even when presented with easy kills. Cowardice dressed up as discipline, in his estimation. The German fighters dropped like hunting falcons, reaching speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. At this velocity, the engagement would be over in seconds. A single firing pass through the bomber formation, then climb away before the escorts could react. But William Campbell wasn't following the script Kessler expected. "Blue flight, maximum power, attack pattern Delta 3. 16 Mustangs suddenly pointed their noses skyward, their Packard V1650 Merlin engines screaming as pilots pushed throttles to the stops and activated water methanol injection. The P-51, already one of the finest fighters in the sky, transformed into a rocket when properly handled. Campbell had been properly handling fighters since he'd first soloed in a PT-17 Stearman at Tuskegee, despite the instructors who'd hoped he'd wash out, despite the training accidents that had been dismissed as evidence of racial inferiority rather than the normal hazards of learning to fly high-performance aircraft. The climbing Mustangs intercepted Kessler's diving formation at 28,000 feet, appearing seemingly from nowhere directly in their path. The German fighters scattered, their careful attack formation dissolving into individual survival instincts. Kessler broke hard left, standing his 109 on its wingtip to evade the American fighters. But Harold Brown had anticipated the move. 3 years of studying aerial combat films and tactics manuals had taught him to read a pilot's intentions through aircraft motion. Harold Brown's 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns spoke for 1.8 seconds. The combined rate of fire, approximately 5,400 rounds per minute, created a cone of destruction that intersected with Kessler's Messerschmitt at precisely the calculated deflection angle. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the 109's relatively thin skin, shredding control cables, puncturing the fuel tank, and shattering the canopy. One round found the supercharger intake, and the entire engine section erupted in orange flame. Kessler felt the sickening lurch as his aircraft transformed from a controlled flying machine into a ballistic object. The control stick went dead in his hands. Smoke filled the cockpit. He reached for the canopy jettison handle, but the mechanism was jammed. Brown's bullets had destroyed the release mechanism. Below him, through the smoke and flames, Kessler saw the red-tailed Mustang executing a perfect barrel roll, already turning to engage another target. The Hauptmann, who had laughed at the circus performers 30 seconds earlier, now fought desperately to escape his burning coffin at 27,000 feet. He finally managed to kick the damaged canopy free and bailed out, deploying his parachute at 15,000 feet. As he drifted down toward Berlin's burning suburbs, Kessler watched the dogfight continue above him. The red-tailed fighters moved with a precision and aggression that contradicted everything he'd been told, every report he'd read, every assumption he'd made. 3 more Messerschmitts fell in flames in the next 90 seconds. The remaining German fighters, their attack completely disrupted, broke off and fled east. Not a single bomber was damaged. The 332nd Fighter Group had been born from America's contradictions. In 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps maintained that Negroes lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage required for combat aviation. The prevailing scientific opinion, endorsed by military leadership, held that black Americans were inherently inferior pilots. The Negro press, civil rights organizations, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had fought for years to force the military to train black pilots. Finally, reluctantly, the Army established a segregated training program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. The military expected, some privately hoped, the program would fail, providing scientific proof of racial theories. They assigned it mediocre resources, second-hand aircraft, and instructors who ranged from indifferent to hostile. Instead, the Tuskegee program produced pilots whose skills exceeded the average white aviation cadet. Because they had to be better, because failure meant confirming every prejudice, because excellence was their only weapon against a system designed to defeat them. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commanding officer of the 332nd, had graduated from West Point in 1936, 4 years of complete social isolation, during which not a single white cadet spoke to him except on official business. He'd graduated 35th in a class of 276, despite this psychological warfare. Davis brought that same iron discipline to his fighter group. His orders were explicit: protect the bombers always. Don't showboat, don't glory hunt, don't give the critics any ammunition. We are fighting 2 wars, Davis told his pilots before their first combat mission. One against the Germans and one against the people in our own country who want us to fail. We will win both. By March 1945, the 332nd had been flying combat missions for over a year. They'd started in Italy, escorting medium bombers on shorter missions. The bomber crews, initially skeptical or hostile, had quickly learned to request the Red Tails specifically. Captain Harold Stevens, pilot of a B-17 called Memphis Belle II, had flown 23 missions with the 332nd as escort. "I don't care what color they are," Stevens told a reporter from Stars and Stripes. "They keep my ass alive. That's all that matters up there." Other escort groups, they'd see German fighters and go chasing them halfway to Poland, leaving us exposed. The Red Tails, they stay with you, like they're chained to your wing. I've seen them pass up easy kills to stay with the formation. What Stevens described as devotion to duty was actually tactical brilliance disguised as conservatism. Davis and his senior pilots had studied aerial warfare systematically, analyzing combat reports, studying German tactics, calculating probability curves. They understood that the Luftwaffe's strategy relied on disruption, separating escorts from bombers, creating confusion, exploiting gaps. Most American fighter groups fell for it, their pilots eager to rack up individual kill scores. The 332nd had developed countermeasures for every German tactic. They flew tighter formations, maintained better radio discipline, and positioned their flights in layered defense that made it nearly impossible to reach the bombers without fighting through multiple screens of fighters. Major Lee Buddy Archer, the 332nd's operations officer and future ace, had written the tactical manual they used. A former chemistry teacher from New York, Archer approached aerial combat like a mathematical problem. Minimize variables, maximize advantages, accept no unnecessary risks. The Germans have fuel shortages, experienced pilots are scarce, and their aircraft production is collapsing, Archer explained to newly arrived pilots. Our job isn't to dogfight, it's to protect bombers while the Germans exhaust their resources trying to stop us. Every mission they can't attack because we're there is a victory. Every bomber that reaches its target is a victory. Kills are just a bonus. This doctrine frustrated some of the more aggressive pilots who wanted to be aces, but it created something far more valuable: trust. By early 1945, bomber crews across the 15th Air Force specifically requested the Red Tails. Some groups even painted red stripes on their own tails in hope that German fighters would mistake them for 332nd protected formations and avoid engagement. The Luftwaffe had noticed. Intelligence reports from interrogated German pilots revealed a growing unease about the Rot-Schwarz Squadron, the Red Tail Squadron. Oberst Johannes Stenhoff, a decorated ace commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, filed a report in February 1945 that directly contradicted the racial propaganda. The Negro fighter group operating from Italy demonstrates exceptional discipline and aggressive defense. Their pilots are well-trained, their tactics sound, their gunnery accurate. Previous intelligence assessments appeared to have been grossly inaccurate. Recommend caution when engaging their formations.
April 1st, 1945. The mission was straightforward on paper. Escort B-17s bombing the Skoda munitions works in Czechoslovakia. Deep penetration into German-held territory over heavily defended industrial targets, with Luftwaffe fighter bases positioned along the entire route. The 332nd launched 58 P-51s that morning. Among them was Captain Edward Fast Eddie Gleed, leading the 301st Fighter Squadron. Gleed had been a star athlete at Howard University before the war, a natural pilot with reflexes that seemed to operate ahead of conscious thought. His wingman was First Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, a former college sprinter from New York who'd trained at Tuskegee in the same class as Harold Brown, no relation. Roscoe had already shot down 3 German fighters, but what distinguished him wasn't kill scores. It was his ability to read developing threats, to sense danger before it materialized. The bomber stream stretched for miles, 120 heavy bombers plowing through scattered clouds at 24,000 feet. The Red Tails maintained their layered escort positions, low flights at 22,000 feet, middle flights at 24,000, top cover at 28,000. Contrails, 3 o'clock high. Brown's voice came through, characteristically calm. Multiple groups. Gleed looked right and up. Against the pale blue sky, white contrails scratched across the stratosphere, the telltale signature of German fighters at high altitude, positioning for attack. I count 30 plus, Gleed transmitted. Mixed types. Looks like they brought everyone. The German formation was indeed massive. Elements from 3 different Jagdgeschwader, including some of the Luftwaffe's remaining veteran pilots. The Reich's air defenses were collapsing, but they could still concentrate strength when strategic targets were threatened. Leading the German formation was Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second highest scoring ace in history with 301 confirmed victories, most achieved on the Eastern Front. Barkhorn had encountered the Red Tails once before, in March, and unlike many of his colleagues, he'd taken them seriously. Remember, Barkhorn transmitted to his pilots, the Rotzschwanzgruppe fights differently. They won't chase, they won't break formation. We must create gaps, force separation. The Germans executed a complex pincer attack, with formations diving from different angles simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the escort screen through sheer numbers. The Red Tails didn't panic. They'd trained for exactly this scenario. Blue and gold flights, take the northern group, Davis's voice came through, commanding the entire group from his position with the bombers. Red and green flights, southern group, white and silver, maintain close escort, do not be drawn out. The response was immediate and coordinated. 24 Mustangs turned to engage the diving Germans, while the remaining 34 stayed locked to the bomber formation like guardian angels. Gleed rolled into a climbing turn that brought his flight into perfect firing position on 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109s diving toward the bombers. The German pilots, expecting the escorts to be out of position, suddenly found themselves flying into a concentration of 12.50 caliber machine guns firing from optimal deflection angles. 2 109s exploded instantly, their fuel tanks igniting from incendiary rounds. A third, severely damaged, broke away trailing smoke. "Leeds got one," Gleed's wingman called out. "Make that 2." But there was no celebration in the transmission, no excitement, just information shared between professionals executing a tactical plan. The dogfight that developed over the next 8 minutes was unlike anything the German pilots had experienced. They were accustomed to American fighters that would chase, that could be drawn away, that fought individually rather than as a unit. The Red Tails fought like a single organism. When a German pilot thought he'd found an opening, he'd discovered 2 more Mustangs already positioned to cover it. When he tried to disengage, he'd find his escape route blocked.
When he attempted to attack the bombers, he'd have to fight through multiple defensive screens. Roscoe Brown found himself in a turning fight with a Focke-Wulf 190, a dangerous position as the German fighter excelled in horizontal combat. But Brown didn't try to outturn the German. Instead, he used the P-51's superior speed to extend away, then whipped back around with an energy advantage, catching the German pilot by surprise. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated under Brown's fire, the pilot never reaching his ejection handle. Major Barkhorn, watching his carefully planned attack fall apart, made a decision that would be recorded in his memoirs years later. He ordered his remaining fighters to break off. "Disengage! Disengage! We cannot penetrate this defense." 12 German fighters had been shot down. 7 more were severely damaged. The bombers reached their target without losing a single aircraft to fighter attack. In the Luftwaffe debriefing that evening, Barkhorn's report was blunt. "The Negro Gruppe represents the finest bomber escort tactics I have encountered in 5 years of combat. Their discipline is extraordinary, their formation integrity absolute, their gunnery accurate. Previous assessments based on racial prejudice are demonstrably false and operationally dangerous. Pilots who underestimate this unit do not return."
The final missions of April 1945 proved to be among the most intense of the air war in Europe. The Luftwaffe, though severely depleted, fought with desperate ferocity to defend what remained of the Reich. Every mission brought massive fighter opposition. The 332nd flew them all. On April 15th, escorting bombers to Dresden, they faced 53 German fighters and shot down 12 without losing a bomber. On April 20th, over Berlin, they encountered the increasingly rare Messerschmitt Me-262 jets and still maintained perfect bomber protection, with Captain Charles Brantley shooting down one of the jets in a nearly impossible deflection shot. On April 25th came the mission that would cement their legend forever. The target was the Škoda Works again. German forces had repaired enough of the facility to resume limited production. Intelligence warned of massive fighter opposition. The Luftwaffe was scraping together every operational aircraft for one final desperate defense. The 332nd launched 64 P-51s that morning, their largest single-mission deployment. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis himself, flying as mission commander. The German Defense Force numbered over 70 fighters, including some of Germany's last surviving aces. Oberst Gordon Golob, 150 victories. Major Hermann Groth, 212 victories. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 confirmed kills, personally flying despite orders to remain grounded as too valuable to risk. They saw the red tails from miles away. "So," Hartmann transmitted to his squadron, "we finally meet the Americans who refuse to be impressed by our reputations." Unlike earlier in the war, there was no mockery in his voice, just the professional acknowledgement of skilled opponents. The battle that developed was the largest single engagement the 332nd would ever fight. For 22 minutes, over 130 fighters clawed and tore at each other across 50 cubic miles of sky, while the bombers droned steadily toward their target below. First Lieutenant Charles Dryden, flying his 57th mission, found himself in a one-on-one duel with an Me-109 flown by a pilot whose skill was immediately apparent. The German anticipated every move, countered every tactic, stayed glued to Dryden's tail through vertical reversals and split-S maneuvers. For 90 seconds they fought, an eternity in aerial combat. The German pilot was better, more experienced, flying a slightly superior aircraft at this altitude. But Dryden had something the German lacked: fuel. The Luftwaffe's desperate fuel shortage meant their pilots flew with minimum reserves. Dryden could afford to use maximum power settings that drank fuel but provided crucial performance advantages.
When the Germans' engine stuttered, fuel starvation, Dryden was already in position. His burst was economical, precise, professional. The 109 went down trailing smoke. Captain Armour McDaniel engaged 3 Focke-Wulfs simultaneously in defense of a damaged bomber. Despite being outnumbered, McDaniel's superior tactics and the P-51's performance advantages allowed him to damage all 3 and drive them off. Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester lived up to his nickname when a 20mm cannon shell hit his P-51's engine and failed to detonate, a dud round that saved his life. Lester nursed his damaged Mustang back to Italy on 1 working cylinder, demonstrating the combination of skill and mechanical reliability that characterized both the pilots and their aircraft. The Germans fought bravely, skillfully, desperately, but they were fighting a losing battle not just against the Red Tails, but against mathematics. The 332nd had fuel for extended combat. They had ammunition for sustained firing. They had replacement aircraft arriving monthly. They had fresh pilots trained to a high standard. The Luftwaffe had none of these things. When the battle finally ended, 13 German fighters were confirmed destroyed, with another 7 probably destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The 332nd lost 2 aircraft. Both pilots successfully bailed out and were rescued. All 63 B-17s reached their target and returned safely. That evening, in the officers' club at Ramatelli Airfield in Italy, bomber crews bought drinks for the Red Tail pilots. The color line, while not erased, had been decisively breached by mutual respect earned through shared danger. Captain Thomas Jefferson, a B-17 pilot from Georgia who'd grown up in a segregated society that taught him black men were inferior, found himself shaking hands with Captain Ed Gleed and saying words he'd never imagined speaking. "You saved my life today. You're the finest pilots I've ever flown with. Color doesn't matter up there, only skill." Gleed smiled, a weary smile that carried the weight of proving himself daily against 2 enemies. "Appreciate that, Captain, but color always matters. What changed today is you realized we're the same as you. We just needed the chance to prove it."
The final accounting of the Tuskegee Airmen's service tells a story that numbers alone cannot capture. The 332nd Fighter Group flew 1,578 combat missions, 311 escort missions, and destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air with another 150 on the ground. They sank a destroyer with machine gun fire, the only fighter group in USAAF history to sink a warship with guns alone. But statistics that meant more than kill ratios. The 332nd maintained the lowest loss rate of any fighter group flying long-range bomber escort. They compiled a nearly unblemished record of bomber protection. So rare were bomber losses on missions they escorted that the "never lost a bomber" claim became legend, even if not mathematically perfect in the strictest sense. What made this achievement extraordinary was not just the tactical skill required, but the burden carried by every pilot. They flew every mission knowing that their failures would be attributed to their race, while their successes would be dismissed as exceptions. They lived in a segregated military that posted armed guards at their base to protect white Italian civilians from black American servicemen. They received hate mail from Americans who believed they had no business in cockpits. And they responded by becoming the most professionally disciplined fighter group in the theater. After the war, captured Luftwaffe reports revealed the German perspective. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff wrote in his memoir, "We were told the Negro pilots were inferior, that they lacked courage and skill. This was propaganda divorced from reality. Their Archfonds group fought with exceptional ability. Their tactics were sound, their gunnery accurate, their discipline admirable. Any pilot who believed the propaganda paid for it with his life."
Major Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest-scoring ace in history, stated in a 1972 interview, "The colored American fighter pilots I encountered were among the finest I faced in the entire war. They understood that aggressive defense could be as effective as offensive hunting. They never gave us easy opportunities. I learned to respect them in the most compelling way possible by barely surviving our encounters." Perhaps the most telling testimony came from Eric Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace of all time, who encountered the Red Tails twice in April 1945. In his 1970 autobiography, he wrote, "I was raised believing in racial superiority. The war taught me many hard lessons, but perhaps the hardest was learning that courage, skill, and intelligence recognize no racial boundaries. The American Negro pilots flew and fought as well as any men I encountered. They were professional, disciplined, and deadly. I learned to fear those Red Tails as much as any aircraft marking in the sky." The transformation of German opinion from mockery to respect happened in less than 2 years, but the transformation of American military policy took longer. The Tuskegee Airmen returned home to a country that still maintained segregated facilities, that denied them service in restaurants, that refused them the GI Bill benefits their white comrades received. They had proven themselves superior warriors against the Luftwaffe, but they still couldn't vote in much of the South, couldn't live in most neighborhoods, couldn't compete for most jobs. Yet their achievement could not be erased. The combat record stood as irrefutable evidence against the scientific racism that had tried to keep them grounded. The testimonials from white bomber crews who owed their lives to black fighter pilots undermined the propaganda of black inferiority. In 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, officially integrating the U.S. military. While multiple factors contributed to this decision, the exemplary service of units like the 332nd Fighter Group made the order inevitable and irrefutable. The men who'd worn those red tails had fought 2 wars simultaneously and won both. They'd destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft while protecting American bombers with unprecedented success. And they'd destroyed something more insidious, the lie that ability, courage, and excellence were determined by the color of a man's skin. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. retired as a 4-star general, the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. He never forgot the lesson he'd learned in the skies over Europe. The privileges of being an American belonged to those brave enough to fight for them. We fought, we bled, we proved our worth. We earned what should have been given freely. On March 29, 2007, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen in a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol. By then, many had passed on, but those who remained stood in their 80s and 90s, their backs straight, their eyes clear. The Tuskegee Airmen served America with distinction, courage, and professionalism during World War II. Through their heroic actions, they overcame discrimination and prejudice to integrate the armed services and serve as an inspiration for future generations. At the ceremony, one of the surviving pilots, now a frail man in his late 80s, was approached by a young German-American who explained that his grandfather had been a Luftwaffe pilot. The old man tensed, expecting confrontation. Instead, the young man said, "My grandfather flew Messerschmitts over Germany. Before he died, he told me about the Red Tails, how they made him feel fear for the first time in years of combat, how their skill forced him to question everything he'd been taught about racial superiority. He said he taught him a lesson that saved his soul, even though you were trying to kill him. Thank you for that lesson. Thank you for your service." The old pilot smiled, a smile that carried 60 years of history. Tell him we were just doing our jobs. We didn't set out to change minds. We just wanted to fly and fight alongside everyone else. But if we changed some minds along the way, well, I guess that's victory too.
In 2012, the George Lucas film Red Tails brought the story of the Tuskegee Airmen to a new generation. While the film took dramatic liberties, it sparked renewed interest in the actual history. the documented achievements that needed no Hollywood embellishment. The real story was more powerful than any fiction. Ordinary men, denied opportunity by the color of their skin, given the worst expectations and the hardest path, who responded by setting standards of excellence that their privileged contemporaries struggled to match. The 332nd Fighter Group didn't just prove that black men could fly fighters, they proved that when given equal equipment, equal training, and equal opportunity, they could exceed the performance of those who'd claimed superiority. Every mission they flew carried extra weight. Every German aircraft they destroyed was a dual victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. Every bomber they brought home safely was evidence against the pseudoscience that had tried to keep them grounded. The laughter of German pilots in early 1943, the mockery of the circus performers with their brightly painted tails had transformed it to something else by war's end. Not just respect, but recognition of a fundamental truth, that prejudice makes you stupid, that underestimating an opponent because of his race is a fatal tactical error. Hauptmann Dieter Kessler, the pilot who'd laughed at the Red Tails over Berlin in March 1945 before being shot down by Harold Brown, survived the war. In a 1989 interview conducted for a German television documentary, he reflected on that encounter. "I was taught that certain races were inferior. I believed it because everyone in authority said it was scientific fact. Then I met those American Negro pilots in the sky, and they shot me down in seconds. As I hung from my parachute watching my aircraft fall in flames, I realized that everything I'd been taught was a lie. The man who just bested me in aerial combat, who'd outflown and outfought me, was supposedly inferior. If he was inferior, what did that make me?" The lie collapsed in that moment. I spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, grateful to be alive, and the rest of my life trying to undo the damage of believing in racial superiority. The Americans called them red tails. We learned to call them what they were, warriors who earned respect through skill, courage, and discipline. They taught us that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's tactically suicidal. The museum at Tuskegee University, built on the grounds where those pilots first trained, contains artifacts that tell the story more eloquently than words. Flight logs documenting missions, gun camera footage showing German aircraft falling, letters from bomber crews thanking their escorts, and photographs of young men in leather flight jackets who defied an entire system to prove themselves. One display case contains 8 .50 caliber shell casings mounted on a wooden plaque. The inscription reads, "These rounds were recovered from a Messerschmitt Bf 109 shot down by First Lieutenant Harold Brown over Berlin, March 24, 1945. They represent more than ammunition. They represent every obstacle overcome, every prejudice defeated, every door forced open through excellence." Another display shows a letter from a German pilot association written in 1985 inviting Tuskegee Airmen to a reunion in Munich. The letter acknowledges, "You were our enemies in war, but our teachers in humanity. You showed us that courage and skill transcend race, that our ideology was built on lies, that honor can be found in those we were taught to despise. We invite you not just as former adversaries, but as brothers in arms who taught us to be better men." Several Tuskegee Airmen attended that reunion. The photographs show elderly black American pilots and elderly German pilots embracing, sharing stories, laughing together. The laughter now one of shared survival and mutual respect rather than mockery and prejudice. The final accounting isn't found in kill ratios or mission statistics. It's found in the changed world the Red Tails helped create. When the U.S. Air Force integrated in 1948, it set the template for integration of all military services. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955, Tuskegee Airman Charles McGee was already serving as one of the Air Force's first integrated squadron commanders, proving daily that competence had no color. When Barack Obama took the oath of office as the 44th President of the United States in 2009, Tuskegee Airmen sat in places of honor at the inauguration. The direct line from those young men who'd fought 2 wars simultaneously to the first black president was not coincidental, it was causal. The legacy of the Red Tails extends beyond civil rights. They revolutionized fighter escort tactics, developing the disciplined defensive formations that became standard doctrine. They pioneered long-range fighter operations, proving that fighters could escort bombers throughout extended missions if properly configured and flown. They demonstrated that aggressive defense could be as effective as offensive hunting, a lesson that influenced fighter tactics for generations. Military historians studying the air war in Europe consistently note that the 332nd Fighter Group's bomber protection record represents one of the finest examples of mission-focused tactical doctrine in military aviation history. They sacrificed individual glory for collective success, refused to be drawn into tactically unsound engagements, and maintained formation discipline that other groups struggled to match. General Daniel Chappie James, the first black four-star general in the U.S. military, flew 101 combat missions during the Korean War. He credited the Tuskegee Airmen with making his career possible. He said, "They kicked down doors that wouldn't have opened otherwise. They proved that excellence cannot be denied. They showed that when you perform better than everyone else, eventually even the most prejudiced person has to acknowledge reality." I stood on their shoulders. We all did. The last surviving Tuskegee Airmen as of this writing are in their late 90s and beyond. They gather annually in commemorations that grow more poignant with each passing year. They wear their distinctive red blazers with gold wings, their backs perhaps a bit bent now, but their pride undiminished. When asked how they want to be remembered, their answer is consistent. We want to be remembered for our service, not just our race. We were Americans who served our country. We happened to be black, and that made our service more difficult, but it didn't make us victims. It made us pioneers. We proved that ability and character matter more than skin color. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. The German pilots who faced them learned that lesson the hard way. The laughter died somewhere over the skies of Europe, replaced with fear, then respect, then finally understanding. The Red Tails had won more aerial victories. They'd won something far more valuable and lasting, proof that prejudice is not just evil, it's stupid, and that excellence transcends every artificial boundary that small minds try to erect. 112 confirmed aerial victories, 15,000 sorties, a bomber protection record unmatched in the theater. But the real victory was this. They forced a nation to confront its lies, a military to discard its prejudices, and an enemy to acknowledge that courage and skill recognize no master race. The thunder of their engines is silent now. The Red Tails no longer patrol the skies over Europe, but their legacy flies on in every integrated military unit, every person of color who pursues a dream once denied, every barrier broken by those who refuse to accept artificial limits on human potential. They were told they couldn't fly. They flew better than those who'd claimed superiority. They were told they lacked courage. They flew into combat that ground lesser men into dust and emerged with honor. They were told they couldn't succeed. They succeeded spectacularly, undeniably, permanently. The German pilots learned to fear the Red Tails. America learned to respect them. History learned to honor them. And the sky learned that it belongs to anyone brave enough and skilled enough to claim it, regardless of the color of the skin beneath the leather flight jacket. That is the true victory of the Tuskegee Airmen. Not just the wars they won, but the future they made possible.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.